Welcome to my ultimate guide to the English monarchy from 1066 to 1603, when the Scottish and English crowns were combined. I'm going to take you through all the kings and queens regnant of England since William the Conqueror booted out the Anglo-Saxons at the Battle of Hastings, and tell you when they were born, reigned and died, plus which of them were murdered, deposed and abdicated, and what many of their major accomplishments were, or just the most infamous events of their reigns. So whether it's the Normans, Plantagenets or Tudors who float your boat, there's something here for you. We start with William the Conqueror, also known as William I. Born in 1027, he reigned from 1066 until his death in 1087. A rare entry on this list who was illegitimate, his parents were Robert, Duke of Normandy, and a woman called Herleva. William is best known for winning the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and deposing the last Anglo-Saxon king, Harold Godwinson. He also oversaw the compilation of the famous Domesday Book, which surveyed English land ownership and was completed in 1086. Did you know that his body was also very badly treated after his death? See my video on what happened to it to learn more. William II, known as William Rufus for his red hair and complexion. He was born in around 1057 and reigned from 1087 to 1100. The third son of the Conqueror, because firstborn male primogeniture wasn't entrenched yet, he was an unpopular king who may have been murdered by an arrow to the chest whilst on a hunting trip in the New Forest. The official party line, though, is that it was a tragic accident. Henry I, born in 1068 in Yorkshire, making him the first Norman king to be English-born. He reigned from 1100 to 1135 and was the Conqueror's youngest son. He seized the throne after his older brother's death, and in spite of the fact that his other brother Robert was the nominated heir, and was a very strict ruler who eventually seized Normandy from Robert too. His only legitimate son died in the infamous White Ship disaster in 1120, leading Henry to name his daughter, Empress Matilda of Germany, as heir. Legend has it he died from eating too many lampreys. King Stephen, born in around 1097 in France, reigned from 1135 to 1154. Stephen was Henry I's nephew, and he seized the throne at the expense of his cousin, Empress Matilda. This led to a years-long conflict known as the Anarchy, as Matilda tried to get her inheritance back, and it inspired the House of the Dragon book and TV show. Matilda did succeed in briefly deposing Stephen in 1141, but she was unpopular with the English magnates and ended up having to flee the country before she could be crowned. Thus, she is not considered to have ever been a true monarch. Coronations were a necessity back then if you wanted to be considered a legitimate ruler. The conflict was eventually settled when it was agreed that the throne would go to her son. Matilda was the first woman post-1066 to attempt to hold the English crown in her own right. We now move on to the Plantagenet dynasty, with the accession of Matilda's son, Henry II, by Geoffrey, Count of Anjou. Henry was born in 1133 and reigned from 1154 to 1189. He married the famous Eleanor of Aquitaine, by whom he sired two more kings of England. A notable event during his reign was the brutal murder of his Archbishop of Canterbury and one-time friend Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170. Henry held together an empire of incredible size across the British Isles and France, but he would eventually fall out with his wife and several sons due to his refusal to allow them much authority and his affair with Rosamund Clifford. Eleanor and some of their boys rebelled against him in 1173, and he had her imprisoned. His sons rebelled again in 1189 and forced their father into a peace agreement, and he died soon afterwards. Richard I, known as the Lionheart, was born in 1157 in Oxford and reigned from 1189 until 1199. Famous for his appearance in the Robin Hood stories, Richard was actually nowhere near as nice as either Disney or Sean Connery made him seem, and he would spend most of his reign out of England fighting in the Crusades. It was on his way back from one such trip that he was captured in 1192 by Leopold of Austria, then sold on to the Holy Roman Emperor. The ransom to free him nearly bankrupted England. He later died from an infection after being shot with an arrow. King John, born in 1167 and the younger brother of the Lionheart. He reigned from 1199 until 1216 and is another king immortalised in retellings of Robin Hood. He is also one of the most poorly thought of kings in English history, which is really saying something when you look at his competition. He lost most of England's French territories, murdered his young nephew Arthur of Brittany, was excommunicated by the Pope, caused England to be put under papal interdict, which was a big deal back then, lost the crown jewels, made himself so hated amongst his barons that they forced him to sign the famous Magna Carta in 1215 to limit his and future monarchs' powers, and caused a civil war when he tried to renege on the deal. The bad reputation he has might just be deserved. Henry III was born in 1207 to King John and Isabella of Angoulême. He reigned from 1216 to 1272 and was only 9 years old when he acceded to the crown. This led to a minority under the oversight of William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke. Henry took control in 1227 but was always seen as a weak and incompetent king. He ended up at war with his barons, who made him sign away some of his power in the provisions of Oxford in 1258, and he and his son Edward were captured in 1264 after he tried to renege on the deal, just like his dad. Fortunately for him, Prince Edward escaped and managed to wrest control back from the rebels, led by Simon de Montfort. Henry's main legacy might be architectural, for he oversaw the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey. Edward I was born in 1239 and reigned from 1272 until 1307. He was a much more effective leader than his father, Henry III, had ever been, though he certainly wasn't a nice guy or someone you'd want to cross. He was actually on crusade when he inherited the throne, but was sure enough of his position that he didn't return for coronation until 2 years later. In the course of his reign, he defeated the native Welsh princes and brought Wales into an administrative union with England in 1284, which continues to this day. He then made his own son the Prince of Wales, setting the precedent of the title being given to the King of England's eldest son. He also banished all Jewish people from England, subjugated Scotland, stole the Scottish Stone of Scone, aka the Stone of Destiny, which would stay in English hands until 1996, and became known as the Hammer of the Scots as a result of his brutal activities. Edward II, born 1284, reigned 1307 to 1327. Not an effective medieval king, Edward lacked the military prowess and leadership savvy of his father. He is famous for his male favourites, Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, upon whom he heaped money, possessions and power, thereby alienating his other barons. He lost the control of Scotland, which his father had fought so hard to achieve, by losing in battle against the Scots at Bannockburn in 1314, despite having the larger army. His wife Isabella of France and her lover Roger Mortimer managed to capture Edward in France in 1324, with the intention of ousting him in favour of his son. The king was forced to abdicate, and he was imprisoned and later murdered in 1327, supposedly by having a red-hot poker inserted up his you-know-what. Edward III, son of Edward II and Queen Isabella, was born in 1312 and reigned for half a century from 1327 until 1377. Initially under the thumb of his mother and Mortimer, Edward broke free of their control in 1330 when he had Mortimer executed and Isabella forced into retirement. Edward's reign is remembered, among other things, for his continued fights with the French and Scots, which led to the start of what is now referred to as the 100 Years' War, and led to the loss of many English-held lands in France. He also invented the Order of the Garter, reigned during the Black Death, which ravaged the country in the late 1340s, and is one of those rare kings who actually had too many sons by his wife Philippa. The rival claims that the existence of so many boys would lead to ultimately caused the Wars of the Roses. Richard II, born 1367, reigned 1377 to 1399. The grandson of Edward III, Richard was the child of Edward the Black Prince and Joan of Kent. Only 10 years old when he came to the throne, He is best remembered for seeing off the peasants' revolt at the tender age of 14 and visiting Ireland in 1394 and 1399, the last king to do so until 1689. He was arrogant, however, and alienated his barons, including his paternal cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who he exiled and whose lands he seized. Big mistake. Bolingbroke brought an army to England in Richard's absence, seized control, and was ultimately able to capture the now former king and lock him up first in the Tower of London, then Pontefract Castle, where the childless Richard was starved to death in February 1400 to stop the plots to restore him to the throne. The Plantagenets gave a whole new meaning to the term dysfunctional families. Speaking of Ireland and families, if you'd like to learn more about your Irish roots, assuming you have any, check out my book Find Your Irish Ancestors online, which is now available as both an ebook and a paperback from Amazon. It provides a directory of websites you can use to trace your Irish family tree and explains how to use them. I'll leave a link for it in the description box below for you. Henry Bolingbroke, who had been born in 1366 or 1367, was now Henry IV, and reigned from 1399 until 1413. He was the son of Edward III's third son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, whose descendants were known as the Lancastrians, and so his blood claim to the throne was weaker than that of the descendants of Edward's second son, who would later become known as the Yorks because they intermarried with the descendants of Edward's fourth son, the Duke of York. It's confusing, I know. This is what caused the Wars of the Roses later in the 15th century, when these two different branches of the Plantagenet dynasty fought for the crown, some relying on their superior blood claim, others on the fact that Bolingbroke had taken the throne by conquest and so effectively reset the line of succession so that it now descended from him. Henry IV faced revolts in Wales and Scotland from those seeking to topple him from his throne and obtain power themselves, but he was always able to put them down, executing numerous nobles as he went. The method by which he had gained the crown was always a cloud over his head, though, and the skin disease he had at the end of his life was viewed by some as a divine punishment for his actions. Henry V, born in 1387, ruled from 1413 until 1422, which is not a long time, but he packed plenty into it. Famous for having survived an arrow to the face during the Battle of Shrewsbury in his youth, I have a video all about it, which those of you with strong stomachs for descriptions of medieval medicine might enjoy. His portraits supposedly only show one side of his face in order to hide the scar. An extremely successful military commander who retained the loyalty of his parliament and barons, he won the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 despite playing some deep odds against a superior force, then had himself declared the heir to the French throne in 1420, married the French princess Catherine of Valois, and ultimately died whilst on another French campaign, having never met his only child by her. That brings us to Henry VI, who was born in 1421 and reigned firstly from 1422 until 1461, and I'll explain why I'm saying reigned firstly in a few minutes. His realm was managed by his paternal uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, and Henry was also crowned King of France in 1431, the only King of England to be crowned monarch in both countries. He gained his majority in 1437, but proved unable to hold together the impressive inheritance amassed for him by his father, and lost control of nearly all of France. His mother, meanwhile, secretly married a lowly Welsh squire named Owen Tudor, and had two more surviving sons, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, who will become important later on. Henry was badly suited to being king. He was ruled by favourites and was more pious than warlike, a bad combination in medieval England. He married Margaret of Anjou, by whom he eventually had one son in 1453, but possibly in response to his massive losses in France, he suffered some sort of breakdown and became catatonic before the time the baby was born, leading to infighting between his wife and his cousin, the Duke of York, over who would rule the country during his absence. This was the start of the Wars of the Roses, as these two branches of the family engaged in battle after battle for the throne. See my playlist on the wars, which looks at all the major players and events, to hear the whole saga. Though he eventually recovered from his mental breakdown, the problems with York continued until the Duke was killed in December 1460, at which point his eldest son, Edward of March, took over the Yorkist claim to the throne and deposed Henry in 1461. The ex-king was later captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London, while his wife and son ended up in exile in Margaret's native France. Edward IV. Born in 1442, Edward was descended twice over from Edward III, including from his second son, giving him that superior blood claim to the throne I mentioned a few minutes ago. Undoubtedly an excellent military leader, he had seized the throne at only 18 years old, and as well as being a good soldier, he was tall, handsome, and a known womanizer, who didn't always make decisions with his brain. Thus, he shocked everyone when he announced his marriage in 1464 to the older Lancastrian widow and Englishwoman Elizabeth Woodville, who brought no great dowry or foreign alliance, but who did have a huge family of siblings and other relatives whose advancement was very unpopular in some quarters, especially with Edward's brother, George Duke of Clarence, and their cousin Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. The rift between Edward and these two ultimately led to them assisting in his deposition in 1470, after they joined forces with Margaret of Anjou and her son, and the reinstalment of Henry VI. Edward's pregnant wife and daughters fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, while he and his youngest brother, Richard Duke of Gloucester, fled to mainland Europe. Henry VI's second reign, known as the Readaption, lasted only 6 months, from October 1470 to April 1471, by which point Edward IV had come back to England with an army and took back the throne, killing his cousin the Earl of Warwick in the process, as well as King Henry's only child, Prince Edward of Wales. Days after his child's death, Henry died too in the Tower of London, where he'd been re-imprisoned. He was almost certainly murdered. Edward IV and Henry VI are the only monarchs on this list to have reigned twice. And so we're back to Edward IV, whose second reign lasted from 1471 until his death. After a series of daughters, he and Elizabeth Woodville at last had 2 sons, called Princes Edward and Richard, and King Edward had his troublesome brother George drowned in a vat of wine in the Tower in 1478. Things were relatively peaceful, with an heir and a spare to the crown, a super trustworthy brother in Richard of Gloucester, who had his own son too, and the Lancastrian line apparently wiped out. There was this distant cousin called Henry Tudor, son of Edmund, who was floating around the continent in exile, but he was descended from an initially illegitimate line of Edward III's, so presumably wasn't a serious threat, especially given all the male heirs with better claims who stood between him and the throne. Life looked pretty good. Unfortunately, the king then dropped dead in April 1483, just shy of his 41st birthday. Brace yourselves, history lovers, this is where things get really ugly. The new king was the 12-year-old Edward V, but this child would have the shortest reign of anyone on this list. His uncle, Richard Duke of Gloucester, promptly seized control of the boy from his maternal half-brother and uncle, both of whom Richard soon had killed, took him to London and installed him in the Tower, ostensibly to prepare for his coronation, which, to be fair, might have been the original plan. Queen Dowager Elizabeth Woodville had fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey again with her other children, but Gloucester soon managed to get her youngest son off her and into the Tower as well. All talk of the coronation of Edward V now evaporated. The 2 boys, erroneously known as the princes in the Tower, were declared illegitimate along with their sisters, and the pair quickly disappeared, while their supporter, Lord Hastings, was summarily executed. Richard took the throne for himself and was crowned on the 6th of July, having also declared that his other nephew and niece, the son and daughter of his older brother George, were also ineligible due to the attainder against the Duke of Clarendon. Bones found in the Tower in the reign of Charles II were assumed to be the 2 lost boys and were interred in an urn in Westminster Abbey. Richard III, formerly the Duke of Gloucester, was born in 1452 and reigned from 1483 to 1485. Like his big brother Edward IV, he was unusual for not being the son or grandson of a king, and like Henry IV, the manner in which he obtained the throne would hang over him the entire time he was on it. Married to Anne Neville, daughter of his cousin the Earl of Warwick, he had 1 son who died in 1484, followed the year after by the Queen. This left Richard with no direct heir. As it became clear the so-called princes in the Tower would not be coming back, plots were hatched to put the outsider I mentioned a minute ago, Henry Tudor, on the throne. The first of these failed in the autumn of 1483, but in August 1485 Henry was back with an army, and at the Battle of Bosworth Richard was killed, the last English king to fall in battle. The whereabouts of his remains were unknown for centuries until he was rediscovered under a car park in Leicester in 2012 and reburied in its cathedral. With his death, the Plantagenet dynasty's rule came to an end, and a new royal house stepped up. It's time to talk about the Tudors. Henry VII was born in 1457 and reigned from 1485 until 1509. His mother was the 13-year-old Lady Margaret Beaufort. His father, Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, was the son of Catherine of Valois and Owen Tudor, and half-brother to Henry VI. He died months before the birth, however. Through Margaret, Henry was descended from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, but that line had originally been illegitimate, and even when Gaunt eventually married his mistress, Catherine Swynford, and had their pre-existing offspring retroactively declared legitimate, because you can do that when you're royal, they were still barred from having any claim on the throne. There was therefore no reason to think that little Henry would ever ascend to the crown. He was a quarter Welsh, a quarter French, and had very little English royal blood, while that which he did possess was tainted. As the half-nephew of Henry VI, though, his life was still marred by the Wars of the Roses. Always on his royal uncle's side, he was forced into exile with his other full uncle, Jasper Tudor, in 1471, after Henry VI had been defeated. He spent the next 14 years on the run from the York kings and was nearly taken back to England to Edward IV and possible death on one occasion. After the male York line had come close to extinction, though, he unexpectedly became the best adult male alternative to Richard III. After winning the Battle of Bosworth, he married Edward IV's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, thereby combining their claims to the throne and bringing an end to the Wars of the Roses. He saw off several attempts to oust him in favour of pretenders, claiming to be either his wife's cousin or one of her brothers, and gained a reputation for avarice. The couple had 2 surviving sons and 2 surviving daughters, but their eldest boy, Prince Arthur, died in 1502 at the age of 15, and Queen Elizabeth died the following year trying to replace him. When Henry VII expired himself in 1509, the throne therefore went to his second son. Henry VIII was born in 1491 and ruled England from 1509 until 1547. Most famous for his 6 wives, 2 of whom he had killed while 2 others were abandoned, he is also remembered for his decision to split from the Roman Catholic Church in Rome in order to annul his first marriage. This brought about the English Reformation, leading to the dissolution of the monasteries and ultimately England's change from a predominantly Catholic country to a predominantly Protestant one. Henry was driven for much of his reign by a desire to produce a legitimate male heir, which he did in 1537 when a surviving son was finally born to his 3rd wife. Tall and very handsome in his early life, he loved jousting and had a reputation for being quite jovial and even generous. As he aged, though, he gained weight and suffered from a horrendous leg ulcer, making his temper increasingly bad, and he ended his days as a tyrant who had executed a number of his family members and favoured ministers. The throne now passed to Edward VI, the son born to Henry VIII in 1537, who reigned until 1553. A minor the entire time, Edward was under the guardianship of his maternal uncle, the Duke of Somerset, at first, until Somerset fell from grace and was executed. Next, it was the Duke of Northumberland who helped the young king to rule. A near fanatical Protestant, Edward was disturbed at the thought of his Catholic half-sister Mary inheriting the crown after him, and wasn't too keen on the idea of his Protestant half-sister Elizabeth either, for he considered them both illegitimate. When he realised he was dying, he attempted to subvert the line of succession established by their father and underpinned by an Act of Parliament, by overlooking both women and leaving the crown to his cousin Lady Jane Grey. He passed away, most likely from TB, at the age of 15, leaving a major succession crisis in his wake. I'm not going to be including Lady Jane in this list of monarchs, as I don't consider her to have been a legitimate queen for the week and a half she supposedly reigned. Instead, we move on to Mary I, Born in 1516 to Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and who defeated Jane's supporters very quickly to take the throne and reign from 1553 to 1558. England's first undisputed queen regnant, Mary was a passionate Catholic, and her reign is largely remembered for her often brutal efforts to reverse the English Reformation. On her watch, nearly 300 Protestants were burned at the stake for refusing to convert, and her marriage to Philip of Spain was deeply unpopular due to fears that England would become a satellite to that country. She also had the blameless Lady Jane Grey, who was really a pawn of her father, executed, though the girl was only 16, and she locked up her sister Elizabeth in the Tower at one point on suspicion of treason. After 2 bogus pregnancies, Mary died, largely unmourned, in her own country. Elizabeth I, born in 1533 to Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, reigned from 1558 until 1603, despite being legally illegitimate from 1536 onwards. Like William the Conqueror, though, this didn't hold her back. She was incredibly clever and shrewd, and a consummate politician, good at keeping her own counsel and saying much without really saying anything. She was also vain and self-centered much of the time. Notable events in her long reign included the official formation of the Anglican Church, the rise of William Shakespeare, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, and the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Known as the Virgin Queen and as Gloriana, she famously refused to marry or name an heir, though she had male favourites, with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the most notable, and the man whom many historians, myself included, think Elizabeth loved. She had no children, so when she died, the Tudor era came to an end, and the throne passed to the son of her nemesis, Mary Queen of Scots, with the English and Scottish crowns finally combined into one. I hope you enjoyed that. Make sure you come back next week when I'll be picking up the story of the now British monarchy from 1603 and taking it to the present day. So that you don't forget or miss the video, why not tap that subscribe button and switch on the notification bell before you go, and YouTube will give you a little reminder when the next episode is released. You can also join my YouTube members by hitting the join button below videos or on my channel homepage, then following the on-screen instructions. I'm on Patreon and Instagram too, and have an Amazon storefront, all linked below. Plus, if you sign up to my free newsletter on my website, historycallingofficial.com, you'll get 2 complimentary downloads giving you tips for recognising good history books versus bad, and interviewing your family members about your genealogy. Finally, a big thank you to those of you who donate to the channel using the thanks button underneath videos for your very kind generosity. Let me know below who your favourite King or Queen of England between 1066 and 1603 is and why. And for more royal history, try one of these videos next. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.